Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, is your lamp lit tonight? Perhaps there's tea cooling beside you, or the faint scent of rain beyond the window. These are the hours when Watson took up his pen, capturing truths others had missed. If you find solace in such quiet investigations, do subscribe. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew well, the world is rarely illegible, only insufficiently examined. You'll also find us on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel, with the link waiting in the description below. Chapter 1. A Curious Document in Baker Street. The autumn of 1895 brought with it a succession of damp, fog-laden mornings that seemed to settle upon London like a grey shroud, blurring the outlines of familiar streets and muffling the customary cacophony of the great metropolis. It was upon one such morning, when the yellow vapours hung so thick about Baker Street that one could scarcely discern the opposite pavement, that there occurred the beginning of that singular affair which I have come to record as the case of the Illegible Testament. I had risen somewhat later than was my custom, having been called out the previous evening to attend to a patient in Kensington whose condition had given cause for concern. Upon descending to our sitting-room, I found Sherlock Holmes already dressed and stationed at the window, his lean figure a dark silhouette against the wan light that struggled through the glass. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the swirling mists below, with that peculiar intensity that I had long since learned to recognise as the outward sign of an active and restless mind. "You observe the fog, Watson?" he remarked without turning, as though my arrival had been anticipated to the very second. "I observe very little else," I replied, helping myself to coffee from the service that Mrs. Hudson had laid upon the table. One might be forgiven for thinking that London had been transported bodily to the Scottish Highlands. Quite so, and yet there are those who must venture forth upon their business regardless of the atmospheric conditions. I have been watching a four-wheeler making its laborious progress up the street for the past 5 minutes. Unless I am much mistaken, it shall presently deposit a visitor upon our doorstep. I joined him at the window and perceived dimly through the murk the outline of a cab that had indeed come to a halt before our door. A moment later came the sound of the bell, followed by the measured tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stair. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, presenting a card upon her tray. Holmes glanced at the pasteboard and raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Adrian Fallow, solicitor of Lincoln's Inn Fields. Show him up, if you please, Mrs. Hudson." Our visitor proved to be a man of perhaps 40 years, possessed of that particular bearing which distinguishes the successful London solicitor. He was dressed with scrupulous correctness in a dark morning coat, and carried himself with a composure that spoke of professional confidence. Yet as he removed his gloves and accepted the chair that Holmes indicated, I detected in his movements a certain constraint, and in his eyes a shadow that suggested some recent disturbance of his customary equilibrium. "Mr. Holmes," he began, settling himself and placing his hat upon his knee, "I must apologise for calling at such an hour and in such weather, but the matter upon which I seek your counsel is of a nature that admits of no delay." "Pray proceed, Mr. Fallow," said Holmes, seating himself opposite our visitor and bringing his fingertips together in that characteristic gesture. "I perceive that you have walked some distance this morning before securing your cab, that you are recently returned from the Continent, and that the matter which troubles you relates to a document of testamentary character." The solicitor started visibly. "Upon my word, Mr. Holmes, your reputation does not exceed the reality. I confess I am at a loss to comprehend how you could possibly know these things." Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "It is elementary. Your boots, though well polished, show traces of the peculiar reddish clay that is to be found in the vicinity of Lincoln's Inn, indicating that you walked from your chambers this morning before taking a cab. The faint odour of French tobacco that clings to your coat, combined with the presence of a customs declaration partially visible in your breast pocket, suggests recent travel upon the Continent. As for the nature of your business, you have unconsciously placed your hand upon your inner pocket no fewer than 3 times since entering this room, suggesting that you carry there a document of some importance, while your professional capacity and evident anxiety make it probable that the matter concerns a will or testament." Mr. Fallow shook his head with an expression of mingled admiration and relief. "You're quite correct upon all points. I have indeed lately returned from Paris, where I had hoped to consult certain experts regarding the very document I carry with me. I fear, however, that they could offer me no assistance, and I find myself driven to seek your aid in what may prove to be the most perplexing case of my professional career." "You interest me exceedingly," remarked Holmes. "Pray give me the particulars." The solicitor drew from his pocket a folded sheet of heavy paper, protected within a leather folder, and laid it upon the table between us. "The matter concerns the estate of Sir Lionel Brentwood, late of Brentwood House in Buckinghamshire. Sir Lionel passed away a fortnight ago at the age of 68, and as his solicitor and executor, it fell to me to examine his papers and execute his final wishes. Among those papers, I discovered this document." He indicated the sheet before us, and I leaned forward to examine it alongside Holmes. What I saw was sufficiently remarkable to justify the solicitor's evident perturbation. The paper appeared to be a will, properly headed and dated, but the body of the text was rendered in a hand so irregular, so distorted and obscured, as to be virtually indecipherable. Characters ran into one another, lines wavered and crossed, and the whole presented the appearance of having been written either in great haste or under conditions of extreme difficulty. "You perceive the difficulty," continued Mr. Fallow. "I have submitted this document to 3 separate graphological experts, all of whom concur that the hand is indeed that of Sir Lionel Brentwood. The signature, you will observe, is clear enough, and corresponds precisely to authenticated examples of his writing. Yet the testament itself is utterly illegible." Holmes had taken up his lens and was examining the document with minute attention. "You have attempted chemical analysis?" he inquired. "I have had the ink tested. It proves to be of a common commercial variety, such as Sir Lionel habitually employed." "And the paper?" "His customary stationery." "The circumstances of Sir Lionel's death?" "He passed away peacefully in his sleep, attended by his physician, Dr. Carruthers of Aylesbury, who had been treating him for a weakness of the heart. There was nothing in the least suspicious about his demise. Yet this will was executed when? According to the date, upon the very evening before his death." Holmes laid down his lens and leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. "You mentioned a circle of interested parties, I presume?" "Indeed. The principal beneficiaries, should the will prove executable, would include Miss Eleanor Brentwood, Sir Lionel's niece and ward who has resided at Brentwood House these past 10 years. There is also Mr. Basil Crowther, the gentleman of independent means who was Sir Lionel's closest friend and frequent companion. The household staff is small, comprising chiefly Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, who has been in Sir Lionel's service for some 20 years. Beyond these, there are certain charitable bequests mentioned in an earlier will, which this document presumably supersedes. And the attitude of these parties toward the present difficulty? Most curious, Mr. Holmes. All appear genuinely desirous of having the matter resolved. Miss Brentwood in particular has urged me to spare no expense in determining her uncle's true wishes. Mr. Crowther has offered every assistance, and even Mrs. Dalrymple has submitted to questioning with remarkable patience. "Remarkable indeed," murmured Holmes. "Tell me, Mr. Fallow, have you formed any theory as to how this singular document came to be written in such a fashion?" The solicitor hesitated. "I confess I have not. Some have suggested that Sir Lionel's final illness may have affected his faculties or steadied his hand, but this seems inconsistent with Dr. Carruthers' testimony that the deceased remained mentally acute until the very end. Others have hinted at deliberate obscuration, but to what purpose I cannot fathom." Holmes rose and stood again at the window, gazing out into the slowly thinning fog. "You have brought me a problem of singular interest, Mr. Fallow. I shall be happy to look into the matter. With your permission, I should like to retain this document for examination, and I propose that doctor. Watson and I should pay a visit to Brentwood House at the earliest opportunity." "I had hoped you would say as much," replied the solicitor, visibly relieved. "I have taken the liberty of informing Miss Brentwood that I intended to consult you, and she has expressed her willingness to receive you at any time convenient to yourself. Then let us say tomorrow morning, weather permitting. In the meantime, I shall subject this curious testament to such analysis as may prove instructive." When our visitor had departed, I turned to Holmes with an expression of puzzlement. "What do you make of it?" I inquired. He stood before the fire, the mysterious document held up to the light. "I make of it, Watson, that we are presented with something far more complex than a simple case of an enfeebled hand or a dying man's confusion. Observe these ink blots at irregular intervals, this variation in pressure suggesting hesitation rather than weakness, and unless my nose deceives me, a faint chemical odour quite distinct from ordinary writing fluid. You suspect foul play? I suspect nothing as yet, my dear fellow. But I observe with interest that Mr. Fallow, though doubtless a capable solicitor, has failed to note the most significant feature of this document. And what is that?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light that I knew so well. "That the hand which wrote this testament was not uncertain, Watson. It was deliberately restrained." He placed the document carefully upon the table and reached for his pipe. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of Baker Street once more. Yet I felt that we were but at the threshold of an affair in which nothing would prove quite as it first appeared. Chapter 2: The Nature of the Illegible. The remainder of that day was devoted to what Holmes termed his preliminary investigation, though to the casual observer it might have appeared that he did little beyond smoking innumerable pipes, and subjecting the mysterious testament to an examination so minute and prolonged that I marvelled at his patience. He had cleared the centre table of all extraneous matter and arranged upon it his chemical apparatus, several powerful lenses, and a variety of reference works drawn from his extensive library of criminological literature. For my own part, I occupied myself with correspondence and the perusal of the morning papers, though I confess my attention wandered frequently to the figure bent over the table, utterly absorbed in his singular task. From time to time he would mutter some observation, more to himself than to me, or would make a notation in that methodical hand of his upon a sheet of foolscap. It was not until the lamps had been lit and Mrs. Hudson had brought up our tea that Holmes finally straightened, pressing his hands to the small of his back with a grimace that spoke of prolonged immobility. "You have discovered something?" I ventured. "I have discovered several things, Watson, though whether they constitute a coherent pattern remains to be determined." He moved to his chair and accepted the cup I poured for him. "The document presents certain features that are, to say the least, remarkable. Beyond its illegibility, the illegibility itself is remarkable, but not in the manner that Mr. Fallow supposes. You recall that I mentioned the handwriting was not uncertain but restrained. I do, though I confess the distinction escapes me." Holmes reached for the document which he had protected within a sheet of glass, and held it toward the lamplight. "Consider the nature of infirmity, my dear fellow. When a man's hand trembles through weakness or disease, the tremor is constant and involuntary. The line wavers uniformly without direction or control. But observe this writing closely. The distortion is not uniform. Here, in this passage, the letters are compressed and run together. Here, they sprawl across the line. In this section, individual characters are formed with reasonable clarity, while in the next, they dissolve into near chaos. I studied the document with renewed attention. You suggest the illegibility is deliberate? I suggest that it follows no pattern consistent with natural infirmity. Moreover, note these ink blots. They occur at irregular intervals, yes, but they are invariably placed at points where a word or phrase might otherwise become legible. That strikes me as less than coincidental. Then you believe the document was deliberately obscured? I believe nothing as yet. I merely observe. He returned to the table and took up a small bottle containing a clear fluid. I have also subjected the ink to preliminary analysis. It contains the expected components of a standard commercial preparation, but there are traces of another substance. Something with a faintly acrid quality that I have not yet identified. Could it not simply be a contamination of some sort? Possibly, but I have examined 3 other documents known to have been written by Sir Lionel within the same period, all employing ink from the same source. None contains this additional element. He fell silent for a moment, gazing into the fire with that abstracted expression that indicated his mind was ranging far beyond the immediate facts. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, more speculative. Mr. Fallow mentioned that Sir Lionel's relations were strained. I should very much like to know the nature of those strains. Wealth alone does not typically produce such elaborate measures as this document appears to represent. There is something deeper here, Watson. Some secret or scandal that has yet to come to light. You believe the will itself may reveal such matters? I believe that someone feared it might. The question is whether that someone was Sir Lionel himself, seeking to conceal his final wishes until after his death, or another party with an interest in preventing those wishes from being known. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the fog of the previous day having given way to one of those crisp autumn days that render London almost beautiful. We departed Baker Street at an early hour, Holmes having sent a telegram to Miss Brentwood announcing our arrival. The journey to Buckinghamshire was accomplished without incident, and by mid-morning we found ourselves approaching Brentwood House, along a country lane bordered by ancient oaks, whose leaves had begun to turn to gold and russet. The house itself proved to be a substantial Georgian structure, built of warm red brick, and possessing that air of quiet prosperity that speaks of old money and careful stewardship. We were admitted by a maid, and shown into a morning room where a woman rose to greet us. Miss Eleanor Brentwood was perhaps 30 years of age, possessed of a composed and dignified bearing that suggested considerable strength of character. She was dressed in mourning, as was proper, but her manner showed none of the excessive grief that sometimes accompanies bereavement. Instead, she greeted us with a calm courtesy that I found rather impressive. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you are most welcome. I'm grateful that you have consented to look into this perplexing matter. May I offer you some refreshment after your journey?" We declined, and Holmes came directly to the point. "Miss Brentwood, I should be obliged if you would tell me something of your uncle's state of mind during his final days." Mr. Fallow indicated that his mental faculties remained unimpaired. "They did indeed, Mr. Holmes. Uncle Lionel was perfectly lucid until the very end. He spoke with me on the afternoon before his death, discussing matters relating to the estate with his customary clarity and precision. And his physical condition? He had been in decline for some months. Dr. Carruthers had warned us that his heart was weak, and that any sudden exertion might prove fatal. But his hands were steady enough. I saw him write a letter to his banker that very day, and the script was as firm as ever I had seen it. Holmes exchanged a glance with me that confirmed the significance of this information. "You're aware of the nature of the will he executed that evening?" A shadow passed across her features. "I am aware only that it exists and that it cannot be read. Uncle Lionel said nothing to me of his intentions regarding the disposition of his property. We were not, I confess, on terms of great intimacy, though I believe he was not displeased with my management of his household." "Had there been any discord between you?" She hesitated, and I detected a slight stiffening in her posture. "We had our differences, as is natural between persons of different generations. Uncle Lionel could be somewhat exacting in his requirements, and he was not always easy to please, but there was no open breach between us. And your own circumstances, if I may inquire. I have resided here since the death of my parents 10 years ago. My uncle provided for me generously, and I have endeavoured to prove worthy of his confidence. As to my future, I possess a small independence of my own, sufficient to maintain myself modestly should the estate pass to other hands." Holmes nodded slowly. "I understand that Mr. Basil Crowther was a frequent visitor here. What can you tell me of his relationship with your uncle?" For the first time a warmer expression crossed her face. Mr. Crowther was my uncle's dearest friend. They had known each other since their university days, and I believe there were few subjects upon which they did not share confidences. Mr. Crowther's visits were always a source of pleasure to Uncle Lionel, particularly during these last months when his health confined him increasingly to the house. Did Mr. Crowther call upon him during those final days? He did. In fact, he was the last person outside the household to see my uncle alive. He departed only a few hours before the end came. Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out across the well-tended grounds. "I should like to examine your uncle's study, if I may, and particularly the desk at which he wrote his final testament." "Certainly. I shall have Mrs. Dalrymple show you the way. The room has been kept locked since his death, at Mr. Fallow's instruction." The housekeeper proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, solid and capable in appearance, says to you with the kind of forthright manner that inspires confidence. She conducted us to a room on the first floor, producing a key from the chain at her waist, and admitting us to what had clearly been Sir Lionel's private sanctum. It was a masculine apartment, lined with books and furnished with the comfortable severity that characterises the studies of scholarly gentlemen. The desk stood before the window, a handsome piece in mahogany with numerous drawers and compartments. Upon its surface lay the implements of writing, an inkstand, a tray of pens, and several sheets of blotting paper. Holmes began his examination at once, applying his lens to every surface with that methodical thoroughness I had so often witnessed. He inspected the pens, the ink, the blotting paper, and finally the desk itself, running his fingers along the edges of the drawers and testing the locks. "This drawer is secured," he observed. "Mrs. Dalrymple, have you the key?" The housekeeper looked troubled. "That drawer has been locked these many years, sir. Sir Lionel kept the key upon his person, and I fear it was not among his effects when he passed." "Indeed?" Holmes's interest was evidently piqued. "And you have no duplicate?" "None, sir." "Then we must manage without it for the present." He turned his attention to the inkstand, removing the stopper and bringing the vessel to his nose. A frown crossed his features. "This is not the same ink as that used in the will." "Oh no, sir," replied Mrs. Dalrymple. "That would be the ink from the writing table in Sir Lionel's bedroom. He took to working there during his final illness, finding it less taxing than descending to the study." "I see. And this other ink, where is it kept?" "In the bedroom still, sir, along with the writing materials Sir Lionel requested." "Then let us repair there at once." The bedroom yielded further items of interest. Upon a small writing table stood another inkstand, and beside it lay a pen with a broken nib. Holmes examined both with minute attention, then directed his glass upon a sheet of paper that had apparently served as a blotter for the final will. What he saw caused him to become very still. For a long moment he studied the paper, adjusting his lens and changing the angle of the light. Then he straightened and turned to me with an expression I knew well. "Watson, your notebook, if you please. I wish to make a record of this before we proceed further." As I transcribed his observations, I understood that we had crossed some threshold in the investigation. The mystery of the illegible testament was beginning to yield its secrets, though the full pattern remained obscured. Yet I could see in Holmes's keen eyes and the set of his jaw that he had glimpsed something that the rest of us had missed, some singular detail that would prove, in time, to be the key to the entire affair. Chapter 3. The Incident at Brentwood House. The sheet of blotting paper that had so arrested Holmes's attention appeared, to my untrained eye, to bear nothing more than the customary marks and impressions left by the absorption of wet ink. Yet as I watched my friend examine it with his lens, tilting it this way and that to catch the light from different angles, I recognised the signs of a discovery that he judged significant. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to Mrs. Dalrymple or myself. "Most instructive." "You found something of importance?" I inquired. He did not answer directly, but instead addressed the housekeeper. "Mrs. Dalrymple, I must trouble you for a few particulars. This writing table, was it positioned thus when Sir Lionel worked here?" "Just so, sir. He preferred the morning light from that window. I was instructed never to disturb the arrangement of his materials." And on the evening he wrote his will, you observed him at this table?" The woman's expression grew troubled. "I did not observe him writing, sir. Mr. Crowther was with him, and I had been given to understand they were not to be disturbed. But I did bring up a tray of refreshment earlier in the evening, and I saw that Sir Lionel had his writing materials laid out as usual." "What time was this?" "Shortly after 7 o'clock, sir." "And Mr. Crowther remained how long?" "Until perhaps 9 o'clock. I heard him take his leave and saw him to the door myself." "Did Sir Lionel ring for you after Mr. Crowther's departure?" "No, sir. The next I knew of anything amiss was when the maid went to attend to him in the morning and found him passed away in his sleep. Dr. Carruthers was sent for at once, and he confirmed that Sir Lionel had died peacefully, likely in the early hours of the morning." Holmes had been making notes throughout this exchange. Now he looked up sharply. "The will bears a date and time. Does it not, Watson?" I consulted my own notes, which I had copied from the document. "It does. The 8th of October, 8:30 in the evening." "Then it was executed during Mr. Crowther's visit, or immediately thereafter?" Holmes returned his attention to the blotting paper, then to the broken pen nib that lay beside the inkstand. He lifted this carefully with his tweezers and examined it beneath his glass. "Tell me, Mrs. Dalrymple, did Sir Lionel habitually break his pen nibs?" "Never, sir. He was most particular about his writing implements. That nib puzzled me when I found it, for I had only just supplied him with fresh pens the day before." "And this bottle of ink, it is the same that he used for the will?" "I believe so, sir. It was his preferred brand, ordered specially from a chemist in London." Holmes unstoppered the bottle and subjected its contents to a careful examination, first by sight, then by scent. His brow furrowed in concentration. "Have you others of the same lot?" "There are 2 more bottles in the supply cupboard downstairs, sir. Shall I fetch them?" "If you would be so good." While Mrs. Dalrymple was thus occupied, Holmes turned to me with an expression of suppressed excitement. "Watson, do you recall my observation regarding the chemical composition of the ink used in the will? You mentioned an unusual acrid quality." "Precisely. And unless I'm much mistaken, this ink contains the same admixture. But I wish to compare it with an unopened bottle from the same source before drawing any firm conclusions." Mrs. Dalrymple returned presently with 2 sealed bottles, all which Holmes opened and tested with the same meticulous care. The result appeared to satisfy him, for he nodded slowly and made another notation in his book. "The ink from these bottles is pure," he announced. "Whatever adulterant was introduced into the ink used for the will, it was added after the bottle had been opened." "But to what purpose?" I asked. "That, my dear Watson, is the very heart of the matter." He straightened and surveyed the room once more. "I should like to examine the remainder of Sir Lionel's papers, if they are available." Mrs. Dalrymple conducted us back to the study, where she indicated a cabinet containing various documents and correspondence. Holmes spent the better part of an hour reviewing these materials, occasionally requesting my assistance in organising them by date or subject. Then what emerged was a portrait of a man whose affairs, while extensive, appeared to have been conducted with scrupulous regularity. There were letters from his banker, his solicitor, various business associates, and a considerable correspondence with charitable institutions to which he had been a generous benefactor. Yet it was among the personal letters that Holmes's attention lingered longest. He had withdrawn a small bundle tied with black ribbon, and was reading through them with evident interest when the door opened and Miss Brentwood appeared, accompanied by a gentleman I had not previously encountered. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "forgive the interruption, but Mr. Crowther has just arrived and expressed a desire to meet you. I thought perhaps you might wish to speak with him." The man who stepped forward was perhaps 50 years of age, as well built and possessing an open, affable countenance that spoke of the good nature and easy disposition. He was dressed with the quiet elegance of a gentleman of means, and his manner combined courtesy with a certain directness that I found immediately engaging. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am delighted to make your acquaintance, though I regret the circumstances that bring you here." He extended his hand, which Holmes shook briefly. "I have been most anxious about this business of poor Lionel's will. If there is any way in which I can assist your investigation, you have only to ask." "You are most kind," replied Holmes. "As it happens, I should very much like to hear your account of your final visit to Sir Lionel. Mrs. Dalrymple informs me that you were with him on the evening he executed his testament." Crowther's expression grew sombre. "I was indeed, and I reproach myself for not having perceived how near his end he was." We spent the evening in conversation, as we had done so many times before. Lionel seemed in reasonable spirits, though I could see that he was fatigued. We spoke of old times, of mutual friends, of various matters that had occupied our attention over the years. Did he mention his intention to write a will? He did. In fact, he asked me to witness his signature, though he said nothing of the document's contents. I naturally assumed it was a straightforward matter of putting his affairs in order, as any prudent man might do when conscious of approaching mortality. "You observed him writing the document?" Crowther hesitated, and I detected a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Not the whole of it, no. He asked me to step outside for a few minutes while he composed the main body of the text, saying that he wished to order his thoughts privately. When he called me back in, he signed it in my presence and requested that I add my own signature as witness." "And the document appeared as it does now, illegible?" "I confess I did not examine it closely. The writing seemed somewhat irregular, but I attributed that to Lionel's weakened state. It did not occur to me that there was anything untoward about it." Holmes had been listening with his eyes half closed, his fingertips pressed together. "Tell me, Mr. Crowther, had Sir Lionel spoken to you previously about the disposition of his estate?" "Only in the most general terms. He had mentioned his desire to provide for Eleanor, of course, and to continue his support of certain charitable causes that were dear to his heart. Beyond that, he was not specific." "Did he speak of any concerns, any matters that troubled him?" A shadow passed across Crowther's face. Lionel had his preoccupations, as we all do. There were aspects of his past that he preferred not to discuss, events from his younger years that he regarded with regret, but he did not burden me with the particulars. "Yet you were his closest friend. Surely he confided in you?" "Friendship, Mr. Holmes, does not always entail complete disclosure. There are some matters that a gentleman keeps to himself, and Lionel was very much a gentleman of the old school." Holmes appeared about to press the point when there came a commotion from below. Voices were raised in the entrance hall, and a moment later the door flew open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his sharp features animated with his characteristic energy. "Mr. Holmes, I heard you were down here and thought I'd better look in. This business of the Illegible will has been reported to us, and I've been assigned to investigate whether there's any criminal element involved." He nodded to the assembled company. "Miss Brentwood, Mr. Crowther, Dr. Watson." Holmes's expression suggested that he regarded this development as less than welcome, but his tone remained civil. "I was not aware that Mr. Fallow had consulted the police." "He hasn't, not officially. But word gets around, Mr. Holmes, and when there's a substantial estate involved and documents that can't be read, well, the Yard takes an interest. I've had a look at the will myself, and if you ask me, it's clear enough what's happened here." "Indeed?" Holmes's voice was dangerously soft. "Pray enlighten us, Inspector." Lestrade drew himself up with an air of satisfaction. "It's plain as a pikestaff. The old gentleman's faculties were failing, weren't they? Heart condition, confined to his bed, death just hours away. The hand that wrote that will was the hand of a dying man, Mr. Holmes. There's no mystery here, just the sad reality of mortality. The will may be irregular, but it's genuine enough. I've seen stranger things in my time. You have examined the physical evidence, I presume? I've seen all I need to see. Medical testimony confirms Sir Lionel died of natural causes. No signs of violence, no suspicious circumstances. The will's a muddle, I grant you. But that's what comes of leaving such matters to the last minute." Holmes said nothing, but I could see the slight compression of his lips that indicated his opinion of Lestrade's reasoning. The inspector, oblivious to the warning signs, continued with increasing confidence. "Mark my words, this will turn out to be exactly what it appears. the final testament of a dying man whose strength failed him even as he tried to set down his wishes. I'll be filing my report to that effect." Holmes moved to the window and stood gazing out at the autumn landscape, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of quiet finality. "Then I shall not detain you, Inspector. By all means file your report, but I would suggest that you refrain from closing the case just yet. There are certain features of this affair that merit closer examination, such as the fact that a man whose hand was supposedly too weak to write legibly managed to produce a perfectly clear signature, such as the presence of foreign substances in the ink, such as the broken pen nib and the curious pattern of the blotting paper. Small things, Inspector, but in my experience it is precisely such small things that illuminate the truth." Lestrade snorted. "You're seeing phantoms, Mr. Holmes. But suit yourself. I'll give you another day or two before I make my final report. Just don't say I didn't warn you when this turns out to be a waste of everyone's time." After the inspector had departed, Holmes remained at the window for several minutes in silence. When he finally turned back to us, his expression was unreadable. "Gentlemen, Miss Brentwood, I thank you for your patience. I have learned what I came to learn. Watson and I shall return to London, but I shall continue my investigation. I trust I may call upon you again should further questions arise." As we made our way back to the railway station in the gathering dusk, I ventured to ask Holmes what he made of Lestrade's theory. "Lestrade," he replied with a thin smile, "has done us the service of demonstrating precisely what we must disprove. Convenience is not truth, Watson, and in this case the convenient explanation is very far from the correct one." Chapter 4. Early Clues and Convenient Conclusions. Upon our return to Baker Street that evening, Holmes exhibited that peculiar restlessness that invariably indicated his mind was actively engaged with a problem. He paced the length of our sitting room for the better part of an hour, smoking his pipe and occasionally pausing to consult the notes he'd made during our visit to Brentwood House. I knew better than to interrupt these perambulations, and instead settled myself with the evening papers, though I found my own thoughts returning repeatedly to the curious circumstances we had encountered. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Holmes finally ceased his pacing and flung himself into his chair with an air of decision. "Watson, I require your assistance with an experiment." I set aside my paper at once. "I am entirely at your disposal." He rose and cleared a space upon the table, then retrieved from his desk drawer the sheet of blotting paper we had obtained from Sir Lionel's writing table, along with several other materials he had collected during our investigation. From a cabinet he produced a powerful lamp, which he positioned at various angles while studying the blotting paper through his lens. "You recall my interest in this seemingly innocuous object," he said, adjusting the lamp once more. "Come here and tell me what you observe." I bent over the paper, applying my own glass as Holmes had taught me. At first I saw nothing beyond the usual smudges and marks left by absorbed ink, but as Holmes adjusted the light to strike the surface obliquely, I began to perceive something more. "There are indentations," I said slowly, "impressions of writing pressed into the paper from above." "Excellent, Watson. And what does that suggest to you?" "That another sheet of paper was placed atop this blotter when something was written upon it. The pressure of the pen transmitted through to create these marks." "Precisely. Now observe with even greater care. What is the character of these indentations?" I studied them more closely, moving the lamp as Holmes had done to catch different angles of illumination. Gradually certain features became apparent. The writing appears clearer than the testament we examined. The letters are more distinct, more regularly formed. Capital. You have put your finger upon the essential point. The indentations reveal writing that is far more legible than the document we possess. The question that naturally arises is this: what became of the original sheet that created these impressions? I straightened, beginning to perceive the direction of his reasoning. "You believe there was another version of the will, written clearly, and that the illegible document we have seen is somehow derived from it?" "I believe we must consider that possibility very seriously indeed. But let us proceed methodically. I propose to attempt a reconstruction of the indented text. What followed was a demonstration of technique that would have done credit to the most accomplished graphologist. Holmes prepared a mixture of fine charcoal powder and fixative, which he applied delicately to the surface of the blotting paper with a soft brush. As the powder settled into the microscopic valleys created by the pressure of writing, letters and words began to emerge with startling clarity. I watched in fascination as fragments of text materialized before our eyes. Though incomplete, what appeared was sufficient to reveal several significant facts. The writing was unmistakably Sir Lionel's hand, but rendered with far greater clarity than the document in our possession. Moreover, certain phrases could be distinguished that bore no resemblance to the illegible testament. "This is extraordinary," I breathed. "The two documents are entirely different." "Not entirely, Watson. Observe here and here. Certain passages correspond, though the execution is vastly divergent. It is as though the same text had been transcribed twice, once clearly and once under conditions that produced the distortion we have observed. But which came first? That is indeed the crucial question. However, I think we may hazard a reasonable inference based upon the physical evidence. The indentations were created by pressure from above, suggesting that the clear version was written first, with the blotting paper beneath it. The illegible version must therefore be subsequent. I considered this carefully. Then someone copied the original will, deliberately distorting it in the process. Or the same hand wrote both versions, the second under constraint or compulsion of some kind. Holmes sat back, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity I knew so well. But consider the implications, Watson. If the illegible document is indeed a copy or revision of a clearer original, then we must ask why such an alteration would be made, and by whom. Could Sir Lionel himself have made the change? It is possible, though it raises difficult questions. Why would a man write a clear testament and then deliberately obscure it before affixing his signature? What purpose could such an action serve? Perhaps he had second thoughts about its contents. Then why not simply destroy the original and write a new one? Why go to the elaborate trouble of creating an illegible copy? No, Watson, there is something more at work here, something that suggests design rather than mere uncertainty. He returned to his notes, rifling through the pages until he found what he sought. Consider also the timeline of events. Mr. Crowther arrives at approximately 7 o'clock. Mrs. Dalrymple brings refreshment and observes the writing materials laid out. Crowther reports that Sir Lionel asked him to step outside while the document was being composed. The will is dated 8:30 in the evening. Crowther departs at 9 o'clock. Sir Lionel dies in the early morning hours. You suspect Crowther of some involvement? I suspect nothing as yet, but his presence during the critical period cannot be ignored. Moreover, his account contains certain features that deserve scrutiny. He claims not to have examined the document closely, yet he witnessed Sir Lionel's signature. Would not any reasonable man glance at a will he was being asked to witness? Perhaps he felt it would be indelicate to read its contents. Perhaps. Or perhaps he already knew what it contained or was meant to contain. Holmes rose and began pacing once more. But let us not focus exclusively upon Mr. Crowther. We must consider all parties who had access to the writing materials and opportunity to interfere with them. Miss Brentwood surely stands to gain the most from the estate. Indeed, and her composure throughout our interview was remarkable. Most beneficiaries display either excessive grief or barely concealed eagerness when discussing the estates of the deceased. Miss Brentwood exhibited neither. She was measured, composed, almost detached. You find that suspicious? I find it noteworthy. It may indicate nothing more than admirable self-control, or it may suggest that she has already reconciled herself to a particular outcome. Remember, Watson, she urged Mr. Fallow to spare no expense in determining her uncle's true wishes. That could be the act of an innocent party seeking justice, or the calculated move of someone who knows precisely what those wishes were and is confident they will favour her interests. What of Mrs. Dalrymple, the loyal housekeeper of 20 years' standing? She had unrestricted access to the writing materials and by her own admission she supplied Sir Lionel with fresh pens the day before his death. She also noted the broken nib, which she found puzzling. If she were involved in some substitution or alteration, would she draw attention to such a detail? Unless she sought to establish her own innocence by appearing observant and candid. An interesting notion, Watson. You're learning to think deviously, which is precisely what this case requires. He paused before the fire, staring into the flames. And then we have the curious matter of the locked drawer in Sir Lionel's desk. Mrs. Dalrymple claims the key was kept upon his person, yet it was not found among his effects. What might such a drawer contain that required such security? Documents relating to the scandal Mr. Fallow mentioned? Quite possibly. A man's secrets are often the key to understanding his actions, and in this case, I suspect Sir Lionel had secrets worth concealing. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor in the person of Inspector Lestrade, who arrived shortly after breakfast with an air of barely suppressed triumph. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Good morning. I thought you'd like to know that I've made considerable progress in the matter of the Brentwood will." Holmes, who had been examining a chemical preparation at his bench, barely glanced up. "Indeed? How gratifying for you." Inspector Lestrade was undeterred by this cool reception. "I've been making inquiries, you see, and certain facts have come to light that cast the matter in quite a different aspect. It appears that Miss Eleanor Brentwood had considerable financial difficulties of her own prior to taking up residence at Brentwood House. Her small independence, as she termed it, was rather smaller than she suggested. In fact, she was nearly destitute when Sir Lionel took her in." "A motive for ensuring she inherits the estate," I observed. "Exactly, Dr. Watson. Moreover, I've learned that she and her uncle had quarrelled on several occasions during the past year. Servants will talk, you know, and the maid I interviewed was quite forthcoming. It seems Sir Lionel had expressed dissatisfaction with certain of Miss Brentwood's domestic arrangements, and had even hinted at making changes to his household." Holmes had set down his retort and was now giving Lestrade his full attention. "You are suggesting that Miss Brentwood had reason to fear being turned out of the house?" "I'm suggesting that she had every reason to ensure the contents of any new will remained unknown until after Sir Lionel's death, when it would be too late to make further alterations. If she couldn't prevent him from writing the will, she could at least render it illegible, couldn't she? And with her access to the household, the opportunity was certainly there. An elegant theory, Inspector. Have you any evidence to support it?" "Motive and opportunity are evidence enough for me, Mr. Holmes. I've seen cases built on less. I'll be interviewing Miss Brentwood again this afternoon, and I shouldn't be surprised if she has some difficulty explaining certain inconsistencies in her account." After Lestrade had departed, I turned to Holmes with a troubled expression. Could he be right? Miss Brentwood did have both motive and opportunity. Holmes returned to his chemical apparatus, but his response was thoughtful rather than dismissive. Lestrade has assembled the facts in a manner that supports a particular conclusion, which is precisely what any competent investigator might do. The question is not whether his theory is possible, Watson, but whether it is necessary. And in this case, I believe we shall find that the truth lies in a rather different direction. You have formed a theory of your own. I have formed several theories, each of which fits certain facts while failing to account for others. What I require now is the single thread that will draw the entire pattern together, and I believe I know where to find it." He crossed to the window and stood gazing out into the street, his profile sharp against the grey London light. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of quiet certainty. "The flaw in Lestrade's reasoning, Watson, and indeed in any theory that focuses upon the obvious suspects and their apparent motives, lies not in what is present, but in what is absent. There is a piece missing from this puzzle, something we have not yet seen or understood. Until we discover it, we are merely arranging shadows into pleasing patterns. What do you propose to do?" He turned from the window with sudden decision. "I propose to examine more carefully the one element of this affair that everyone else has dismissed as irrelevant. The broken pen nib, Watson. That trivial detail may yet prove to be the key that unlocks everything. Chapter 5. Interviews and Silences. The next 2 days saw Holmes engaged in what he termed the groundwork of investigation, that patient accumulation of facts and testimony, without which he maintained no sound conclusion could be reached. He had dispatched a series of telegrams immediately following Lestrade's visit, and the responses to these had evidently satisfied him sufficiently to warrant a second journey to Buckinghamshire. We set out on a grey morning, the countryside still wrapped in the remnants of an overnight mist. Holmes was uncommunicative during the journey, his gaze fixed upon the passing landscape, though I doubted he saw any of it. He held in his lap a leather portfolio containing his notes and various samples he had collected, and from time to time he would open it and study some particular item with absorbed attention. "You have learned something from your telegrams?" I ventured at last. "I have learned that Sir Lionel Brentwood's past was considerably more complex than his respectable present might suggest, but I prefer to verify certain matters through direct questioning before forming any definite conclusions." We were received at Brentwood House by Miss Eleanor herself, who appeared somewhat surprised by our return, but maintained her customary composure. Holmes wasted no time in preliminaries. "Miss Brentwood, I must ask you some questions that may seem intrusive, but I assure you they are essential to my investigation. Your uncle's hand, during his final illness, did it truly show signs of deterioration?" She hesitated, and I observed a faint colour rise in her cheeks. I may have overstated the matter when we last spoke. Uncle Lionel's grip had weakened, certainly, and he tired more easily, but his penmanship remained quite legible in the documents I saw him produce. "Why then did you suggest otherwise?" "I suppose I wished to find a rational explanation for the state of the will. The alternative, that something irregular had occurred, seemed too troubling to contemplate." She met Holmes's gaze directly. "I am not accustomed to deception, Mr. Holmes, and I fear I am rather poor at it. On the contrary, you have been remarkably candid, which I appreciate. Tell me, did your uncle ever speak to you about his early life before he established himself in Buckinghamshire?" "Very little. I understood that he had made his fortune in business ventures abroad, but he was reticent about the particulars. He preferred to focus upon his present circumstances and his philanthropic work." "And his relationship with Mr. Crowther, how would you characterize it?" "As I mentioned before, they were the closest of friends. Mr. Crowther was one of the few people with whom Uncle Lionel seemed entirely at ease. I often thought their friendship dated from a time when both were very different men from what they became. Different in what respect? Younger, perhaps less cautious. Uncle Lionel once mentioned that he and Mr. Crowther had shared certain adventures in their youth that they preferred not to revisit. I took it to mean nothing more than the usual high spirits of the young gentleman." Holmes made a note, then asked, "During the past year, when you and your uncle disagreed, what were the subjects of these disagreements?" Miss Brentwood's composure faltered slightly. "You have been speaking to the servants, I see." "Yes, we had our differences. Uncle Lionel believed I was too liberal in my charitable donations to certain causes he deemed unworthy. He also disapproved of some of my acquaintances in London. We quarrelled about these matters, but never seriously. Certainly not with such heat as to make me fear for my position in his household. Yet Inspector Lestrade believes otherwise." "Inspector Lestrade," she replied with surprising spirit, "is determined to find villainy where there is only misfortune. I had no hand in whatever happened to that will, Mr. Holmes. I can only hope you are better equipped than the inspector to discover the truth." Our next interview was with Mr. Basil Crowther, whom we found in the library engaged in sorting through some of Sir Lionel's books. He greeted us with his customary affability, though I detected a certain wariness behind his pleasant manner. "Mr. Crowther," Holmes began without preamble, "I should like you to describe in greater detail your final conversation with Sir Lionel. What subjects did you discuss during those hours you spent together?" Crowther set down the volume he had been examining and gestured for us to be seated. "We spoke of many things, as old friends do. The state of his health, naturally, memories of our younger days. He was in a reflective mood. as men often are when they sense their time drawing short. Did he mention his will? Only to say that he wished to set his affairs in order. He asked me to witness his signature, which I was honoured to do. Yet you didn't read the document you were witnessing. A flicker of something crossed Crowther's features, too quick for me to identify. As I explained previously, I felt it would be presumptuous to examine its contents closely. Mr. Crowther, I have made certain inquiries into Sir Lionel's past. I understand that 30 years ago, he and you were involved in a business venture in India that ended rather badly. The change in Crowther was immediate and striking. His affable expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its warmth. That is ancient history, Mr. Holmes, and has no bearing on present matters. On the contrary, I believe it may have considerable bearing. The venture involved investment in certain railway securities that proved fraudulent. Sir Lionel and you both lost significant sums, but there were others who lost far more, were there not? Crowther rose and moved to the window, his back to us. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as though each one required effort. There were investors who trusted our judgment. We had no knowledge that the securities were worthless. When the fraud was discovered, Lionel and I did what we could to make restitution, but it was insufficient. Some families were ruined. And Sir Lionel carried the burden of that guilt throughout his life. We both did, Mr. Holmes. It shaped everything that came after. Lionel's philanthropy, his careful management of his subsequent business affairs, his desire to live a life above reproach. All of it stemmed from that early catastrophe. Holmes's voice softened slightly. Did he speak of this matter during your final visit? Crowther turned back to face us, and I was startled to see genuine emotion in his eyes. He said he wished to make certain arrangements to ensure that old debts were finally settled. He did not elaborate, and I did not press him. I assumed he meant to include provisions in his will for the descendants of those who had suffered from our youthful folly. Yet you had no curiosity about the specific contents of that will. I had every curiosity, Mr. Holmes, but also sufficient delicacy not to indulge it. Lionel's final wishes were his own affair. Mrs. Dalrymple, when we interviewed her in the housekeeper's parlour, proved more forthcoming than she had been during our first visit. Perhaps Holmes's manner had grown less formal, or perhaps she had overcome her initial nervousness, but she spoke with greater freedom than before. Mr. Crowther asked about the ink supplies, you say, Holmes prompted. Yes, sir, some weeks before Sir Lionel's death. He inquired whether we kept the same brand that Sir Lionel preferred, and whether there were bottles unopened. I thought it curious at the time, but Mr. Crowther explained that he wished to purchase the same sort for his own use, as he admired the quality. Did he examine the bottles? He did, sir. I showed him one from the supply cupboard, and he made note of the manufacturer's mark. And did anything unusual occur in the household during Sir Lionel's final weeks? Mrs. Dalrymple's brow furrowed in concentration. There was one odd incident, now you mention it. I found Sir Lionel's bedroom door locked one afternoon when I went to attend to his comfort. This was unusual, as he generally preferred to keep it open. When I knocked, Mr. Crowther answered, and said that Sir Lionel was resting and wished not to be disturbed. But I could hear them talking, sir, quite earnestly, though I could not make out the words. When was this? 3 days before Sir Lionel passed away. Holmes thanked her, and we returned to the entrance hall, where we encountered Mr. Adrian Fallow, who had arrived to attend to some legal matters relating to the estate. Holmes detained him for a brief conversation. Mr. Fallow, you mentioned during our first meeting that Sir Lionel's relations were strained. Can you be more specific? The solicitor glanced about to ensure we would not be overheard. Sir Lionel was a man with a past, Mr. Holmes. He had made enemies in his youth through that unfortunate business in India. Though he had largely outlived them, he feared that certain revelations might still damage his reputation and the charitable institutions he supported. He spoke to me once about the need to protect his name after death. Did he specify what revelations he feared? He did not, but I gathered they related to that financial scandal. He seemed to believe there were documents or records that might cast him in an unfavourable light. The locked drawer in his desk, perhaps, Fallow's eyes widened. "You know about that?" "Yes. I suspect that is where such papers might be kept. Sir Lionel once mentioned that he had preserved certain documents as a safeguard, though against what I could not say. During our journey back to London, I reflected upon the testimonies we had gathered. Each person we had interviewed had offered fragments of information that seemed significant, yet I could not perceive how they fit together into a coherent pattern. "Holmes," I said at last, "I confess I'm more confused than enlightened. Everyone appears to have something to hide, yet no one seems overtly guilty." "An admirable summary, Watson. You have identified the central difficulty of the case. We are presented with a surfeit of possible motives and opportunities, yet something essential remains hidden." He tapped the portfolio on his lap. "But I believe I am beginning to perceive the outline of the truth. Each of these interviews has been instructive, not in what was said, but in what remained unspoken." "What do you mean?" "Consider what we have learned. Miss Brentwood admits to quarrels with her uncle, but insists they were not serious. Crowther confesses to a shared past that both men wish to conceal, yet claims ignorance of the will's contents, misses. And Dalrymple reports Crowther's interest in the ink and a locked door. Fallow speaks of Sir Lionel's fear of posthumous revelations. Each testimony contains a silence, Watson, a point at which the speaker draws back from complete disclosure." "You believe they are all concealing something?" "I believe each is protecting something, whether their own interests or those of others. But there is one person whose silence is most eloquent of all." "Who?" Holmes gazed out at the darkening landscape, his profile sharp against the window. "Sir Lionel himself, Watson. Through his illegible testament he has created a puzzle that forces us to examine not merely what he wrote, but why he wrote it in such a fashion. Until we understand his purpose, we cannot hope to unravel the truth. But he is dead. How can we divine his purpose? By understanding the one thing that motivated all his actions in his later life, the desire to atone for his youthful mistakes, and by recognizing that sometimes, Watson, the most profound truths are concealed not through deception, but through what appears to be confusion." He fell silent after this cryptic remark, and I knew better than to press him further. Outside, night had fallen completely, and the lights of London began to appear in the distance. We were returning to Baker Street, but I sensed that the real journey toward understanding had only just begun. Chapter 6. Motives Beneath Respectability. The week that followed our return from Buckinghamshire saw Holmes engaged in what might have appeared to the casual observer as a period of indolence. He spent long hours in his dressing gown, curled in his armchair with volumes drawn from his shelves, or at his chemical bench conducting experiments whose purpose he did not explain. Yet I had known him long enough to recognize these apparent periods of inactivity as the outward manifestation of intense mental labour. It was on the Thursday evening, as we sat before the fire after dinner, that Holmes finally broke his contemplative silence. "Watson, what do you know of the Indian railway frauds of the 1860s? I considered the question. "Very little, I confess. There were several scandals involving worthless securities, were there not?" "Several indeed, but one in particular interests me. In 1864, a syndicate offered shares in the Calcutta and North Western Railway Company, promising investors substantial returns from a line that was to connect the interior provinces with the coast. The securities were backed by what appeared to be solid government guarantees and expert surveyor reports. Hundreds of families invested their savings, and the railway proved fraudulent. The railway did not exist, Watson. Not 1 mile of track was ever laid. The surveyor reports were forgeries, the government guarantees counterfeit. When the fraud was exposed, the principal organisers had vanished with the invested capital. Those who had promoted the scheme in good faith were left to face the ruin of their investors. And Sir Lionel was among these unwitting promoters? Holmes rose and retrieved a bound volume of newspaper clippings from his desk. "I have spent the past several days in the reading room of the British Museum, examining contemporary accounts. Sir Lionel Brentwood and Basil Crowther were young men then, recently returned from India with modest fortunes and ambitions to increase them. They were approached by the organisers of the fraud and, believing the scheme legitimate, encouraged their friends and families to invest. When the collapse came, it destroyed not only the investors but the reputations of all associated with the promotion. He handed me the volume, open to a yellowed newspaper account dated August 1864. I read of angry creditors, of families impoverished, of two young gentlemen who had offered to make what restitution they could from their own resources. The names of Lionel Brentwood and Basil Crowther featured prominently. This must have haunted them, I observed. It shaped the remainder of their lives. Sir Lionel rebuilt his fortune through careful, conservative investments and devoted himself to philanthropy as a form of atonement. But consider, Watson, what such a scandal meant for a man of ambition. The doors of society would have been closed to him. His reputation would have been permanently tainted by association with fraud, however innocent his involvement. Yet he did rebuild his reputation. Brentwood House, his charitable work, all suggest a man who achieved respectability. Precisely. He achieved respectability, but at what cost? And more importantly, what would he have done to preserve it? Holmes began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. I have made further inquiries. Sir Lionel's charitable donations were considerable, yes, but they were directed toward very specific beneficiaries. I obtained a list from his banker. Of the 23 organisations he supported, 12 can be directly connected to families ruined in the railway fraud. He was making restitution, even after all these years? He was paying for silence, Watson. So long as those families received his generosity, they had no reason to resurrect the scandal. But what would happen upon his death? Without his continued support, might not some of them be tempted to speak publicly of the past? And in speaking, might they not reveal details that Sir Lionel preferred remain hidden? I began to perceive the direction of his reasoning. You believe the will contained provisions to continue these payments? I believe the will contained provisions that would have exposed the true nature of his philanthropy, which in turn would have revealed the extent of his guilt over the railway fraud. The very act of ensuring continued payments would require explanation. An explanation would mean acknowledging, however indirectly, his role in the affair. But surely after 30 years the matter could be viewed with some forgiveness. Holmes shook his head. The families most severely affected would not view it with forgiveness. Moreover, consider the damage to the charitable institutions that bore Sir Lionel's name. If it became known that their benefactor's generosity stemmed not from pure altruism, but from an attempt to conceal his involvement in a fraud, however innocent, the scandal would taint everything he had built. His life's work of redemption would be reinterpreted as mere self-interest. Then Sir Lionel himself might have had reason to obscure the will. It is a possibility we must consider, but there is another element to this affair that troubles me even more. He returned to his chair and fixed me with an intense gaze. I made inquiries into Mr. Crowther's present circumstances. His fortune, such as it is, derives largely from investments managed by Sir Lionel over the years. He lives comfortably, but not lavishly, and his income depends upon the continued performance of those investments. I fail to see the significance. Then consider this. Among Sir Lionel's papers at Brentwood House, I found correspondence with his banker regarding the transfer of certain investment accounts. The transfers were to take effect upon his death, and would have removed Mr. Crowther as a beneficiary of the income they generated. I sat forward, startled by this revelation. Sir Lionel intended to cut Crowther off. Not entirely, but substantially. The correspondence suggested that Sir Lionel had discovered something that troubled him deeply about Crowther's conduct. The letters were circumspect, but the implication was clear. Whatever their long friendship, Sir Lionel had decided that it must end, at least in financial terms. Did Crowther know of this intention? That, Watson, is the essential question. If he did, then he had compelling reason to ensure that Sir Lionel's final will never took effect, or at least that its contents remained unknown long enough for alternative arrangements to be made. I rose and began pacing myself, my mind racing through the implications, but Crowther witnessed the will. He admitted to being present when it was executed. He admitted to witnessing a signature. He claimed not to have examined the document itself. Yet, as I observed before, what man witnesses a will without at least glancing at its contents? Unless, of course, he already knew what it contained or had reason to ensure it could never be properly read. The adulterated ink, I breathed. Crowther asked Mrs. Dalrymple about the ink supplies weeks before Sir Lionel's death. Precisely. And we know that the ink used in the will contained a foreign substance, something that would degrade legibility over time. If Crowther had access to Sir Lionel's writing materials, if he knew the location of the ink, if he had opportunity during his final visit. Holmes trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air between us. I found myself both attracted to and repelled by this theory. It possessed an elegant logic, yet it seemed almost too convenient. "You suspect Crowther of tampering with the will," I said slowly, "of deliberately rendering it illegible to prevent its execution. I suspect him of having both motive and opportunity. Whether he availed himself of that opportunity remains to be proven. But consider the sequence of events. Crowther visits Sir Lionel on the evening the will is to be executed. He asks to remain while it is written, then conveniently steps outside during its composition. He returns to witness the signature but claims not to have read the document. The will is found to be illegible, written in ink that has been chemically altered, and Crowther's fortune depends upon that will never being properly executed. Yet, he has been entirely cooperative with the investigation. He has offered every assistance. Which is precisely what a guilty man might do to deflect suspicion. By appearing open and helpful, by expressing concern for the proper settlement of the estate, he establishes himself as above reproach. It is a common enough stratagem. I returned to my chair, troubled by the weight of evidence Holmes had assembled. "What do you propose to do?" "I propose to examine the one piece of evidence we have not yet fully explored, the locked drawer in Sir Lionel's desk. If my theory is correct, that drawer contains documents relating to the railway fraud and possibly evidence of whatever discovery led Sir Lionel to alter his financial arrangements with Crowther. The key was not found among Sir Lionel's effects, but there are other means of access. You intend to force the lock? With the permission of the executor, naturally. I shall send a telegram to Mr. Fallow tonight requesting his authorization. If he agrees, we shall return to Brentwood House tomorrow and discover what Sir Lionel deemed worthy of such protection." Holmes rose and moved to his desk to compose the telegram, but I remained seated, my thoughts circling around the case like moths around a flame. The theory he had constructed was compelling, built upon solid evidence and logical inference. Crowther had motive, opportunity, and the technical means to commit the crime. Yet something troubled me about the conclusion, some element that seemed not quite to fit. "Holmes," I said, "if Crowther did alter the will, why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not simply destroy it?" He paused in his writing and looked up. "An excellent question, Watson, and one to which I do not yet have a satisfactory answer. The destruction of the will would have left Sir Lionel's previous testament in force, which might not have served Crowther's interests. Or perhaps he feared that destroying the document entirely would invite suspicion, whereas rendering it illegible might be attributed to Sir Lionel's failing health. Or perhaps, I ventured, we are looking at this from the wrong angle entirely." Holmes regarded me with an expression of interest, or elaborate. Suppose the illegibility was not intended to prevent the will from being executed, but to delay its execution, to create a period of uncertainty during which something else could be accomplished. An intriguing notion, but what could be accomplished during such a delay? I confess I do not know, but the more I consider this affair, the more I feel that we are missing something fundamental about its nature. Holmes smiled, a rare expression of unguarded warmth. "You are developing admirably as an investigator, my dear fellow. Your instinct is sound. There is indeed something we have not yet grasped, but I believe the contents of that locked drawer will illuminate much that is presently obscure." He returned to his telegram and I picked up the newspaper, though my mind remained fixed upon the puzzle we had been set. Outside, the sounds of London at evening filtered through our windows, the clatter of hansom cabs, the distant cry of a vendor, the measured tread of a constable on his rounds. It was the familiar music of the city, steady and reassuring. Yet within the walls of 221B Baker Street, we grappled with questions of motive and deception, of past sins and present consequences, of the lengths to which a man might go to protect his fortune and his reputation. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. But I could not shake the feeling that the true nature of the game had yet to be revealed. Chapter 7. The False Solution. Mr. Fallow's response arrived by return telegram the following morning, granting Holmes the authorization he sought to examine the locked drawer. Then we were preparing to depart for Buckinghamshire, when a message was brought up from Inspector Lestrade requesting an immediate meeting at Scotland Yard. Holmes received this summons with evident reluctance, but concluded that we could spare an hour before catching our train. We found Lestrade in his office, surrounded by papers and wearing an expression of unmistakable satisfaction. He rose to greet us with more warmth than was his custom, gesturing for us to be seated. "Gentlemen, I am glad you could come. I wanted you to hear this directly from me before I make my arrest. The Brentwood case is solved, Mr. Holmes. Solved completely and conclusively." Holmes settled into his chair with an air of patient resignation. "Indeed, Inspector, I confess you have been more expeditious than I anticipated." "When the facts speak clearly, Mr. Holmes, there is no need for elaborate theories. I have assembled evidence that points unequivocally to one suspect." He shuffled through his papers and withdrew several documents. "Miss Eleanor Brentwood is the perpetrator of this fraud, and I can prove it." I leaned forward with interest despite myself, while Holmes merely steepled his fingers and waited for Lestrade to continue. "First, the matter of motive. I have obtained testimony from Sir Lionel's banker that Miss Brentwood was in substantial debt at the time she entered her uncle's household. Furthermore, Sir Lionel had recently expressed concern about certain expenditures she had made without his authorization. The banker recalls Sir Lionel stating that he intended to speak severely to his niece about her management of the household accounts. "Circumstantial," observed Holmes mildly. "Perhaps, but consider the opportunity. Miss Brentwood had unrestricted access to every room in Brentwood House. She supervised the household supplies, including the writing materials. She knew her uncle's habits intimately, and would have known precisely when and where he intended to write his will." "As would Mrs. Dalrymple and Mr. Crowther." Lestrade. "Dalrymple and Mr. Crowther." Lestrade waved this objection aside. "But neither of them had the same compelling financial interest. Mrs. Dalrymple is a servant of modest expectations. Mr. Crowther is a gentleman of independent means. But Miss Brentwood stood to inherit a fortune, provided the will could be interpreted in her favour, or, failing that, prevented from being executed at all." He withdrew another document with a flourish. "I have here a statement from a chemist's shop in Aylesbury. 3 weeks before Sir Lionel's death, a lady matching Miss Brentwood's description purchased a quantity of oxalic acid, claiming it was needed for cleaning purposes." "Oxalic acid is commonly used in household cleaning," I interjected. "It is also a substance that, when mixed with certain inks, can cause them to fade or become illegible over time." Lestrade's tone carried a note of triumph. "I had the ink from the will analysed by an expert at the Yard. He confirms the presence of oxalic acid in significant quantities." Holmes's eyes had sharpened with interest. "You have done thorough work, Inspector. What else have you discovered?" "I have discovered a pattern of behaviour consistent with guilt. Miss Brentwood has been evasive when questioned about her whereabouts on the evening the will was written. She claims to have been in her room, but the maid reports that when she went to ask about dinner arrangements, Miss Brentwood's room was empty." "At what hour?" "Shortly after 8 o'clock, precisely the time when Sir Lionel was writing his will." "And Miss Brentwood's explanation for this absence?" "She claims she was walking in the garden seeking air on an October evening, Mr. Holmes, in the gathering darkness. Does that strike you as credible?" I found myself unable to immediately refute Lestrade's logic. The evidence he had assembled was indeed compelling. Miss Brentwood had motive, opportunity, and apparently the means to commit the crime. Her behaviour contained elements that might reasonably be interpreted as suspicious. Holmes, however, appeared curiously unmoved. He sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze distant, before speaking. "Tell me, Inspector, have you considered alternative explanations for these facts?" "What alternative explanations could there be? The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence never speaks for itself, Lestrade. It must be interpreted, and interpretation requires imagination as well as logic. Consider, why would Miss Brentwood purchase oxalic acid from a shop in Aylesbury, where she might be recognised, rather than obtaining it discreetly in London? Perhaps she did not anticipate that her purchase would be traced. A woman planning to commit fraud through chemical means fails to consider the most basic precaution. That seemed inconsistent with the elaborate nature of the crime itself." Lestrade frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that the facts you have assembled, while accurate, may admit of interpretations other than the one you favour. But pray continue. You mentioned Miss Brentwood's evasiveness. In what other respects has she behaved suspiciously?" "She has shown remarkable composure throughout this affair. Most innocent parties would display more distress at being suspected of such a crime." "Or perhaps more guilt," Holmes murmured. "Composure can indicate either innocence or guilt, depending upon one's interpretation," I ventured to interject. "Inspector, you mentioned that Miss Brentwood stood to inherit under the will, but we do not know what the will says. How can you be certain she benefits from it?" "Because Sir Lionel had no other close relations. Who else would he name as his principal heir? And if the will cannot be read, it cannot be executed, which means the previous will remains in force, a will that does provide for Miss Brentwood's inheritance." Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out over the Thames. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of something I might almost have termed sympathy. "Inspector, you have constructed a theory that accounts for most of the observable facts. It is logical, coherent, and satisfies the requirements of motive and opportunity, and any jury would likely find it persuasive." Lestrade beamed. "Then you agree with my conclusion?" "I did not say that." Holmes turned back to face us. "I said your theory accounts for most of the facts, but it fails to account for certain other elements that I consider equally significant. Such as the broken pen nib, which you have not mentioned, such as the pattern of the ink blots on the document, such as the indentations on the blotting paper, which reveal a clearer version of the text beneath, such as Mr. Crowther's interest in the ink supplies, such as the locked drawer in Sir Lionel's desk. Your theory explains what is visible, Inspector, but it does not explain what is hidden." Lestrade's expression had grown defensive. "I deal with evidence, Mr. Holmes. Not speculation about hidden things." "Then you deal with half the truth at best. Every crime contains two elements, what the perpetrator does and what the perpetrator conceals. You have focused entirely upon the former while ignoring the latter." "And I suppose you have a better theory?" Holmes returned to his chair, his manner thoughtful rather than combative. "I have several theories, each of which fits certain facts while failing to account for others. Unlike you, Inspector, I am not yet prepared to declare the case solved. There are questions that remain unanswered, and until they are answered, any conclusion must be considered provisional." "What questions?" "Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to render a will illegible rather than simply destroying it? Why does the illegibility follow no consistent pattern? Why was the will written on the evening of Sir Lionel's final visit from his closest friend? What is contained in the locked drawer of his desk? And most significantly, why does everyone connected with this affair appear to be concealing something, even those who have no obvious motive for deception?" Lestrade gathered his papers with an air of injured dignity. "You may pursue your questions as you see fit, Mr. Holmes. I have a duty to act upon the evidence I possess. I shall be obtaining a warrant for Miss Brentwood's arrest this afternoon." After we had departed Scotland Yard and were making our way toward the railway station, I turned to Holmes with considerable agitation. "Holmes, surely Lestrade cannot be right. Miss Brentwood does not strike me as a criminal. She does not strike me as one either, Watson. But that proves nothing. The most successful criminals are precisely those who do not appear criminal. However, I believe Lestrade has committed the cardinal error of constructing his theory around the most obvious suspect and then selecting only those facts that support his conclusion while disregarding those that contradict it. Yet the evidence against her is substantial. The evidence against her is consistent with guilt, but it is equally consistent with innocence. That is the flaw in Lestrade's reasoning. He has mistaken consistency for proof. We had reached the station and were boarding our train when I posed the question that had been troubling me since Lestrade's presentation. "What do you believe happened, Holmes?" He settled into his seat and gazed out the window as the train began to move. "I believe that we have been examining this affair from the wrong perspective. We have been asking who rendered the will illegible, when we should have been asking why it needed to be rendered illegible in the first place. We have been focused upon the crime, when we should have been focused upon what the crime was meant to prevent. I confess you have lost me entirely. Then consider this, Watson. Every action we have observed in this case, the chemical alteration of the ink, the irregular handwriting, the timing of the will's execution, all of these things suggest not impulsiveness but careful planning. Yet the plan itself appears to have no clear objective. If the goal was to prevent the will from taking effect, why not destroy it? If the goal was to ensure a particular inheritance, why create uncertainty about the document's contents? Perhaps the perpetrator hoped the illegibility would be attributed to natural causes. Precisely what Lestrade believes. But if that were the intention, why make the illegibility so elaborate? Why not simply produce a will with slightly shaky handwriting that could be attributed to illness? No, Watson, there is something more at work here. Some purpose we have not yet grasped. The train carried us through the autumn countryside, the fields golden with harvested grain, the trees brilliant with their dying leaves. I found myself reflecting upon Lestrade's case against Miss Brentwood. It was compelling, yet something in Holmes's manner suggested that he saw beyond the surface of the evidence to some deeper truth. "You mentioned that the flaw in Lestrade's theory lies not in what is present but in what is absent," I said. "What did you mean?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the passing landscape. "I meant that he has failed to ask the most important question of all, which is, why, in a case where everyone appears to have something to hide, does the one person who is dead seem to be hiding the most?" He would say nothing further during the journey, and I was left to ponder this cryptic observation as we approached Brentwood House for what I sensed would be a decisive encounter. The locked drawer awaited us, and with it, I hoped, the answers to the questions that had thus far eluded even Sherlock Holmes's formidable powers of deduction. Yet I could not escape the feeling that whatever we discovered in that drawer would not simplify the mystery but deepen it, revealing layers of complexity we had not yet begun to fathom. Chapter 8. The Singular Detail. We arrived at Brentwood House to find the household in a state of considerable agitation. Miss Brentwood met us in the entrance hall, her composure visibly shaken for the first time since our acquaintance. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you have come. Inspector Lestrade was here not an hour ago with a warrant for my arrest. Only Mr. Fallow's intervention secured me a brief reprieve. He has gone to consult with a barrister, but the inspector made it clear that he intends to take me into custody before the day is out." Holmes's expression grew stern. "Lestrade moves with more haste than wisdom. Miss Brentwood, I must ask you directly. Did you purchase oxalic acid from a chemist in Aylesbury 3 weeks before your uncle's death?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I did, Mr. Holmes, for cleaning the brass fixtures in the drawing-room which had become badly tarnished. Mrs. Dalrymple can confirm this. The fixtures were indeed cleaned, and I have the receipts for both the acid and the polishing cloths I purchased at the same time. Did you at any time have access to your uncle's writing materials?" "I had access to everything in this house, Mr. Holmes. I managed the household, but I did not tamper with my uncle's will, nor would I have had reason to do so. Whatever he chose to leave me, I would have accepted gratefully. Whatever he chose to leave to others, I would have respected as his right. There was a dignity in her bearing that I found deeply affecting. Holmes, however, maintained his professional detachment. "I believe you, Miss Brentwood, but belief is not proof, and Lestrade has assembled a case that will persuade a magistrate if not countered with facts. That is why I must examine the contents of your uncle's locked drawer without further delay." We proceeded to the study, where Holmes produced from his pocket a set of implements I recognised as his lockpicks. Within moments he had manipulated the mechanism, and the drawer slid open to reveal its contents. What we found was both illuminating and troubling. The drawer contained a collection of documents relating to the Indian Railway fraud, including correspondence with the families who had suffered losses, the records of payments made over the years, and a detailed accounting of Sir Lionel's attempts at restitution. There was also a leather-bound journal which Holmes examined with keen attention. "This is Sir Lionel's private record of the affair," he said, turning the pages carefully. "It chronicles his involvement in the fraud, his discovery of the deception, and his subsequent efforts to make amends. The entries span 3 decades. I looked over his shoulder at the neat, precise handwriting that filled the pages. His hand is perfectly steady throughout. Indeed, not a tremor, not a waver. This is the hand of a man in full control of his faculties." Holmes turned to the final entries, dated in the weeks before Sir Lionel's death. His eyes narrowed as he read, and I saw his jaw tighten in a manner that indicated a significant discovery. "Oh, Watson, listen to this entry from the 15th of September, less than a month before Sir Lionel's death. I have learned that which I had long suspected but hoped never to confirm. B.C. has not been honest with me about his own involvement in the affair. The documents I secured from India prove beyond doubt that he had knowledge of the fraud from the beginning. He saved himself while allowing me to bear the public blame. I cannot continue our friendship under such circumstances, nor can I permit him to profit further from my guilt. The new will shall reflect this truth." Miss Brentwood had gone pale. Uncle Lionel discovered that Mr. Crowther had betrayed him. So it would appear, but there is more. Holmes turned to another entry, dated the 1st of October. "Here. B.C. came to me today, pleading for understanding. He spoke of necessity, of circumstances I could not comprehend. He begged me not to alter the will, claimed that his very survival depends upon the income I have provided. I was unmoved. A man who would sacrifice his friend's reputation to preserve his own deserves neither friendship nor charity. I told him my decision is final." Holmes closed the journal and stood in silence for a moment, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Then he turned to me with an expression I had rarely seen upon his features, a mixture of excitement and grim satisfaction. "Watson, we must return to Baker Street immediately. There is an experiment I must conduct, and it cannot wait." "But what of Miss Brentwood? Lestrade intends to arrest her." "Miss Brentwood will not be arrested. Then I shall send a telegram to Lestrade instructing him to take no action until he hears from me. If he values his reputation, he will comply." The journey back to London seemed interminable. Holmes sat clutching Sir Lionel's journal and the bottle of ink we had obtained from the bedroom, his whole being focused upon some chain of reasoning that he did not share. I knew better than to interrupt his concentration, though my own mind churned with questions and half-formed theories. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately set to work at his chemical bench. He prepared several glass slides with samples of the ink, treating each with different reagents and examining the results under his microscope. I watched as he made careful notations, occasionally muttering observations that seemed to confirm some hypothesis he was testing. It was nearly midnight when he finally straightened from his work and turned to me with an expression of triumph. "Watson, I have it. The final piece of the puzzle. The ink. The ink indeed. Observe." He gestured to his array of slides and solutions. "I have conducted a temporal analysis of the ink's degradation. When first applied to paper, this ink appears entirely normal, but over the course of several hours, a chemical reaction occurs. The oxalic acid, which has been dissolved in the ink itself, begins to interact with the iron galatannate compounds that give the ink its colour. The result is a gradual fading and distortion of the writing. Then the illegibility was not present when the will was first written. Precisely. The will was written clearly, Watson, perfectly clearly, but over the following hours and days, the treated ink degraded, rendering the text progressively more difficult to read until it achieved the state in which we now find it. I struggle to grasp the full significance of this discovery, but it means that someone introduced oxalic acid into the ink bottle before Sir Lionel wrote his will. When he used that ink, he created what appeared to be a clear, legible document. But he had unwittingly condemned his own words to gradual obliteration. "Crowther," I breathed. He asked Mrs. Dalrymple about the ink supplies. He had access to the bedroom where the ink was kept. Holmes began pacing, his energy renewed by the confirmation of his theory. "Consider the diabolical cleverness of it, Watson. Crowther could not destroy the will without arousing suspicion. He could not prevent its execution. But he could ensure that by the time anyone examined it after Sir Lionel's death, the document would be unreadable. The signature would remain clear. He took care not to tamper with that, but the body of the text would be lost. Why not tamper with the signature as well? Because a will without a valid signature is clearly void. That would have invited immediate suspicion and led to questions about who had access to the document. But a will with a clear signature and illegible content, that could be attributed to Sir Lionel's failing health, to the trembling hand of a dying man. It was meant to appear as natural degradation, rather than deliberate sabotage. I sank into my chair, overwhelmed by the elegant malice of the scheme. But Holmes, how do we prove this? The ink has already degraded. We cannot demonstrate what it looked like when first written. Can we not? Holmes returned to his bench and selected one of his slides. "I have here a sample of the treated ink, freshly applied to paper. Observe its clarity. Now watch as I introduce additional oxalic acid solution and accelerate the degradation process through the application of heat and light." Over the course of the next hour, I witnessed a transformation that confirmed Holmes's theory beyond any doubt. The clear, legible writing on the slide gradually distorted, the letters blurring and running together, the text becoming increasingly difficult to decipher. By the end of the experiment, it bore a striking resemblance to the illegible testament. "Remarkable," I murmured, "but there is still one element I do not understand. You mentioned that Sir Lionel's hand showed no signs of tremor in his other writings. How does that fit with your theory?" Holmes's smile was grim. "That, Watson, is the detail that proves Crowther's guilt beyond any doubt. Lestrade and others assumed that the illegibility was present from the moment of writing, caused by Sir Lionel's failing strength. But examine these documents from Sir Lionel's desk, all dated the same day as the will. The handwriting is firm and steady, no tremor, no hesitation." He placed several letters before me, and I saw at once what he meant. Sir Lionel's hand had been perfectly controlled on the day he wrote his will. The illegibility could not have been caused by physical infirmity. Therefore, Holmes continued, the illegibility must have been introduced after the fact through chemical means. And the only person who had both the motive and the opportunity to introduce those chemical means was Basil Crowther. "What do you propose to do?" Holmes consulted his watch. "It is too late to act tonight, but tomorrow I shall request that all parties meet us here at Baker Street. I shall demonstrate what occurred and offer Crowther an opportunity to explain himself. If he is wise, he will confess. If not, the physical evidence will condemn him regardless." He moved to the window and stood gazing out at the darkened street. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something approaching sadness. "It is a melancholy business, Watson. Two men bound by friendship and shared guilt, their relationship poisoned by an ancient betrayal. Crowther sacrificed Sir Lionel's reputation to save his own, then lived for 30 years on Sir Lionel's charity. When that charity was threatened, he struck back with a cunning born of desperation. He did not murder Sir Lionel, the man's death was natural, but he murdered his friend's final wishes, and in doing so revealed the depths of his own moral bankruptcy. I joined him at the window, looking out upon the city where countless human dramas played out each day, most of them hidden from view. Do you think Sir Lionel suspected what Crowther might do? I think Sir Lionel was a man who had learned the hard way that trust must be earned, and that even the oldest friendships can conceal the deepest treacheries. But I do not think he anticipated the specific manner in which Crowther would act. If he had, he would surely have taken precautions. And Miss Brentwood is innocent. As I believed from the beginning, Lestrade constructed his case around circumstantial evidence and failed to perceive the true nature of the crime. It is a common enough error, but in this instance it nearly resulted in a grave injustice. We stood together in silence as the city's lights glimmered in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and revelation, the final accounting for a crime that had been committed with chemical precision and almost succeeded in its purpose. But tonight I found myself reflecting upon the nature of friendship and betrayal, and upon the lengths to which a man might go to protect himself from the consequences of his own actions. The case of the Illegible Testament was drawing to its close, but the human tragedy it represented would linger long after justice had been served. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The following afternoon found our sitting room arranged to accommodate what Holmes had termed the final assembly. Miss Brentwood had arrived first, accompanied by Mr. Fallow, both wearing expressions of anxious hope. Mrs. Dalrymple sat near the window, her capable hands folded in her lap. Inspector Lestrade occupied a chair near the door, his face a study in sceptical curiosity. Only Mr. Basil Crowther had yet to make his appearance. "He will come," Holmes assured us, consulting his watch. I sent him a telegram indicating that I had made a discovery that would resolve the matter of the will in a manner favourable to all parties. Curiosity, if nothing else, will compel his attendance. Indeed, scarcely 5 minutes had elapsed when we heard the bell, and presently Crowther was shown into the room. He greeted the assembly with his customary affability, though I detected a certain wariness in his eyes as they settled upon Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, you have gathered quite a council. I confess you have piqued my interest considerably. Your telegram suggested good news regarding poor Lionel's testament." "I have news," Holmes replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Whether it is good depends upon one's perspective. Pray be seated, Mr. Crowther. What I have to relate concerns us all." Once everyone was settled, Holmes rose and moved to stand before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He cut a striking figure in that familiar posture, and I knew from long experience that we were about to witness one of those demonstrations of logical reasoning for which he had become celebrated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have been brought together by a document that appeared to defy comprehension. The last will and testament of Sir Lionel Brentwood was written in a hand so irregular and distorted as to be virtually illegible. This apparent illegibility has given rise to theories of declining faculties, of deliberate obscuration, and even of outright fraud. Inspector Lestrade has gone so far as to prepare charges against Miss Brentwood, based upon circumstantial evidence that, I grant, appeared compelling." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. "However," Holmes continued, "like all mysteries, this one yields to patient observation and logical analysis. I propose to demonstrate to you not only what happened to Sir Lionel's will, but why it happened, and at whose hand." He moved to the table where he had arranged his chemical apparatus and various exhibits. "Let us begin with the physical evidence. First, the will itself." He held up the document, protected now within a sheet of glass. "When Mr. Fallow first brought this to my attention, I observed several anomalies. The handwriting was not merely poor, but inconsistent, suggesting constraint rather than infirmity. There were ink blots at irregular intervals, always positioned where they would obscure potentially legible passages, and the ink itself possessed a faint chemical odour, distinct from ordinary writing fluid." "I noticed nothing of the sort," Lestrade interjected. Which is precisely why you reached an erroneous conclusion, Inspector. But let us proceed. I next examined the writing implements used to create the document. Among these was a broken pen nib, which Mrs. Dalrymple found puzzling because Sir Lionel was notably careful with his writing materials. Mrs. Dalrymple nodded in confirmation. I then subjected the blotting paper from Sir Lionel's writing table to a bleak illumination, revealing indentations left by the pressure of writing. These indentations showed text that was considerably clearer than the document we possess. This suggested that another version had been written, one that was legible. Holmes produced his reconstructed image of the indentations. From these impressions, I was able to ascertain that Sir Lionel had indeed written a clear will. The question then became, what transformed that clear document into the illegible one we now possess? He moved to his chemical display. The answer lies in the nature of the ink. Analysis revealed the presence of oxalic acid, a substance that, when dissolved in standard writing ink, produces a delayed reaction. The writing appears perfectly normal when first applied to paper, but over time, the acid interacts with the iron compounds in the ink, causing progressive degradation and eventual illegibility. But Miss Brentwood purchased oxalic acid, Lestrade protested. We have established that fact. Indeed she did, for the entirely innocent purpose of cleaning brass fixtures. The receipts and the cleaned fixtures themselves confirm her account. But consider, Inspector, if Miss Brentwood intended to use the acid to render the will illegible, why would she purchase it locally where the transaction could be traced? Why not obtain it discreetly in London, where such a purchase would attract no notice? Lestrade had no ready answer to this. No, Holmes continued. The oxalic acid used to adulterate the ink came from another source entirely, and we know who had both the interest and the opportunity to introduce it into Sir Lionel's writing materials. All eyes turned to Crowther, whose affable expression had frozen into immobility. Mr. Crowther, Holmes said, his voice taking on a harder edge, you asked Mrs. Dalrymple about the ink supplies several weeks before Sir Lionel's death. You inquired about the specific brand he used and whether there were unopened bottles available. When questioned about this, you claimed you wished to purchase the same sort for your own use. But you never did make such a purchase, did you? Crowther's hands had tightened on the arms of his chair, but he said nothing. What you did instead was obtain oxalic acid through other means and introduce it into the opened bottle of ink that Sir Lionel was using. You did this during one of your visits to Brentwood House, at a time when you had access to the bedroom where the writing materials were kept. Mrs. Dalrymple reported finding the bedroom door locked one afternoon, with you inside claiming that Sir Lionel was resting. That was when you tampered with the ink. This is speculation, Crowther managed, though his voice had lost its confidence. Is it? Then let me offer you proof. Holmes produced the journal we had discovered in the locked drawer. This is Sir Lionel's private record of his involvement in the Indian Railway fraud of 1864. The final entries make for particularly illuminating reading. Shall I share them with the Assembly? A muscle twitched in Crowther's jaw. That journal is private. It was private. It is now evidence. Sir Lionel discovered, less than a month before his death, that you had known of the fraudulent nature of the railway scheme from the beginning. You had knowledge of the deception but chose to remain silent, allowing him to promote the securities in good faith while you protected yourself from association with the fraud. Miss Brentwood gasped. Mr. Crowther, is this true? Lionel misunderstood the circumstances, Crowther said, but the words lacked conviction. Holmes pressed forward relentlessly. Sir Lionel not only understood the circumstances, he documented them. He obtained papers from India that proved your complicity, and based upon that discovery, he informed you that he intended to revise his will, removing you as a beneficiary of the income from certain investments. Your comfortable existence, Mr. Crowther, depended upon Sir Lionel's continued support. When that support was threatened, you took action. I did nothing illegal. Lionel died of natural causes. Indeed he did. You did not murder Sir Lionel Brentwood. You murdered his final wishes. Holmes's voice rang with quiet intensity. You could not prevent him from writing a new will. You could not destroy the document without arousing suspicion, but you could ensure that its contents would never be known. By introducing treated ink into his writing materials, you guaranteed that anything he wrote would gradually become illegible. You witnessed the signing of the will, saw that it was clearly written, and knew that within days it would be unreadable. You cannot prove this. Can I not? Holmes gestured to his chemical apparatus. I have reproduced the exact degradation process in controlled conditions. I can demonstrate that ink treated with oxalic acid behaves precisely as I have described. I have Sir Lionel's journal documenting your betrayal and his intention to alter his will. I have testimony that you inquired about the ink supplies and had access to the writing materials. And I have one final piece of evidence that condemns you utterly. He produced several letters from Sir Lionel's desk. These documents were written by Sir Lionel on the same day as his will. Observe the handwriting. It is firm, steady, controlled. Not a tremor, not a waver. Sir Lionel's hand was perfectly sound on the day he wrote his final testament. The illegibility of the will could not possibly have been caused by physical infirmity. It was caused by chemical sabotage, carried out by the one person who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The silence that followed was profound. Crowther sat motionless, his face drained of colour. Then slowly his shoulders sagged and something seemed to collapse within him. "You understand nothing," he said quietly. "Lionel's righteousness, his need to atone for ancient sins, it consumed him. He never forgave himself for that railway fraud, never accepted that we were victims as much as anyone. Yes, I knew the scheme was suspect. I warned him, but he would not listen. When it collapsed, I protected myself because I saw no purpose in both of us being ruined. Was that so terrible?" "You allowed your friend to bear the blame alone," Holmes said, "and I paid for it every day for 30 years. I lived on his charity, yes, but also with his judgment, his constant moral superiority. He provided for me out of guilt, not friendship. And when he finally discovered the truth, he did not seek understanding. He condemned me, cut me off, left me to face poverty in my old age." "So you struck back," I said, unable to contain myself. Crowther's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a mixture of defiance and despair. I struck back against his will, not his person. I wanted time, that is all. Time to make other arrangements, to secure my future before the world learned that Lionel Brentwood had cast off his oldest friend. I meant to delay the execution of the will, not prevent it forever. I thought perhaps we might find a way to interpret his wishes, to reach some accommodation. Instead, you created a legal morass that cast suspicion on an innocent woman," Holmes said sternly. "Your delay threatened Miss Brentwood with arrest for a crime she did not commit. I never intended that. I thought the illegibility would be attributed to Lionel's illness. I did not anticipate that anyone would be blamed." "Then you're not merely a criminal, Mr. Crowther, but a foolish one. Did you truly believe that such an obvious forgery would escape scrutiny?" Crowther had no answer. He sat slumped in his chair, a broken man facing the consequences of his desperation and his pride. Inspector Lestrade had risen to his feet. "Basil Crowther, I'm placing you under arrest for the willful obstruction of justice and the falsification of a legal document. You will accompany me to Scotland Yard." As Lestrade produced his handcuffs, Crowther looked once more at Holmes. "How did you know? What gave me away?" Holmes's expression softened slightly. "You were too helpful, Mr. Crowther. Too eager to assist, too quick to volunteer information. An innocent man might have been reserved, even defensive. But you played the role of the cooperative witness with such conviction that it became clear you were playing a role. That, combined with your interest in the ink and your presence during the critical period, made you the only logical suspect." "And the broken pen nib?" "The nib broke because Sir Lionel, in writing his will, pressed harder than usual. He was angry, documenting your betrayal and his response to it. The pressure of his emotion found expression in the pressure of his pen. It was, in its way, a testament to the depth of his feelings about what he had discovered." Crowther nodded slowly, then rose and submitted to the handcuffs with a dignity I had not expected. As Lestrade led him toward the door, he paused and looked back at Miss Brentwood. "I am sorry," he said simply. "Your uncle was a better man than I. He deserved a better friend." Then he was gone, and we were left in a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the London street below. Chapter 10. The Clear Hand of Truth. In the days that followed Crowther's arrest, Holmes devoted himself to the task of reconstructing Sir Lionel's true testament. It proved a more formidable challenge than even he had anticipated, requiring the application of every technique of chemical restoration and graphological analysis at his disposal. I watched with admiration as he worked tirelessly at his bench, treating sections of the degraded document with various reagents, comparing the results against the indentations preserved in the blotting paper, and gradually piecing together the puzzle that Crowther's treachery had created. Mr. Fallow called frequently to observe the progress, and it was during one such visit that Holmes was able to present him with a complete transcription of the will's contents. "I cannot guarantee that every word is precisely as Sir Lionel wrote it," Holmes cautioned, "but I am confident that the substance and intent are accurate. The indentations on the blotting paper provided an excellent template, and the chemical restoration revealed sufficient fragments to confirm the reconstruction." Fallow studied the document with evident relief. "This is remarkable work, Mr. Holmes. Quite remarkable. And the provisions are much as I had anticipated, knowing Sir Lionel's character as I did." The will, as reconstructed, revealed a man who had thought carefully about both justice and mercy. Miss Brentwood was indeed named as the principal heir to the estate, receiving Brentwood House and the bulk of Sir Lionel's personal property. However, the testament also established a trust fund whose income was to be distributed annually among the families who had suffered losses in the railway fraud of 1864, ensuring that Sir Lionel's atonement would continue beyond his death. And most significantly, there was a lengthy preamble in which Sir Lionel had set down a full account of his involvement in the fraud, accepting responsibility for his role in promoting the worthless securities while documenting the circumstances that had led to his unwitting participation. It was a statement of extraordinary candour, seeking neither to excuse nor to conceal, but simply to acknowledge the truth. Regarding Basil Crowther, the will made no direct mention of him, but the provisions removing him as a beneficiary of certain investment incomes were clear enough. There was, however, a sealed letter addressed to Crowther, which Fallow had found among Sir Lionel's papers, and which, after some deliberation, he provided to the authorities to be delivered to the prisoner. We never learned the contents of that letter, but when Crowther appeared before the magistrate for his preliminary hearing, his demeanour suggested that whatever Sir Lionel had written, it had affected him profoundly. He pleaded guilty to the charges of obstruction of justice and falsification of a legal document, sparing Miss Brentwood the ordeal of a trial and accepting his sentence with a resignation that bordered on relief. It was a grey afternoon in late November when Miss Brentwood called at Baker Street to thank Holmes personally for his efforts on her behalf. She was no longer dressed in mourning, and though the events of recent weeks had clearly taken their toll, there was a quiet strength in her bearing that spoke well of her capacity to endure adversity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I can never adequately express my gratitude for what you have done. You have not only cleared my name, but restored my uncle's true wishes to light. That means more to me than any inheritance." Holmes, who was never comfortable with expressions of gratitude, waved her thanks aside. "I did only what logic and observation required, Miss Brentwood. The truth was there to be discovered by anyone with the patience to look for it. Nevertheless, you looked where others did not. Inspector Lestrade was prepared to condemn me on the basis of circumstantial evidence." "Lestrade is a capable investigator within his limitations," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic generosity. "But he lacks imagination, and imagination is essential when dealing with crimes that depend upon misdirection rather than force. Your case required one to see not merely what was present, but what had been deliberately obscured." Miss Brentwood hesitated, then asked the question that I sensed had been troubling her since the revelation. "Do you believe Mr. Crowther truly meant me harm, or was I simply an unfortunate consequence of his desperation?" Holmes considered this carefully before responding. I believe Mr. Crowther was a man who had spent 30 years living with the consequences of a single choice made in his youth. He protected himself at your uncle's expense, and that choice poisoned everything that came after. When Sir Lionel finally discovered the truth and chose to sever their connection, Crowther responded not with acceptance, but with further deception. He convinced himself that he was merely buying time, that no real harm would come of delaying the execution of the will. In that sense, you were indeed an unfortunate consequence rather than an intended victim, but that does not absolve him of responsibility for the suffering his actions caused. I suppose I should hate him, she said quietly, but I find I cannot. He seems more pitiable than villainous. That speaks well of your character, Miss Brentwood. Hatred is a poison that harms the one who harbours it more than its intended target. You are wise to refuse it. After she departed, Holmes stood at the window watching her climb into her carriage, and I saw in his expression something approaching melancholy. "A sad business, Watson," he observed. "Two men bound by a shared past, their friendship destroyed by betrayal and guilt, and in the end both lost. Sir Lionel died with his final wishes obscured, and Crowther faces imprisonment for a crime born of desperation rather than malice." "Yet justice has been served," I replied. "The will has been reconstructed, Miss Brentwood's name has been cleared, and Crowther will answer for his actions." Justice, yes, but at what cost? Holmes turned from the window and moved to his chair. The railway fraud of 1864 destroyed lives and fortunes. Sir Lionel spent 3 decades attempting to make amends, to atone for his unwitting role in that destruction. Yet his very attempt at atonement created the circumstances that led to Crowther's betrayal. Had he simply accepted the past and moved forward without the burden of guilt, might not all have ended differently? You cannot mean that Sir Lionel was wrong to seek restitution. I mean that righteousness can be as destructive as sin when pursued without mercy or understanding. Sir Lionel demanded of himself a standard of moral perfection that was perhaps admirable, but also unforgiving. When he discovered Crowther's complicity, he responded with judgment rather than compassion. He cut off a man who had depended upon him for 30 years, offering no gradual transition, no opportunity for Crowther to adjust to his altered circumstances. In doing so, he created the very conditions that led to Crowther's desperate act. I found this assessment troubling. Surely you do not defend Crowther's actions. I defend nothing. I merely observe that human affairs are rarely as simple as we might wish them to be. Crowther was guilty of betrayal, yes, but Sir Lionel was not entirely innocent of precipitating the final crisis. Both men were prisoners of their past, unable to escape the consequences of choices made decades ago. He fell silent, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Outside, the fog had begun to gather once more, softening the outlines of Baker Street into indistinct shapes and shadows. "You know, Watson," he said at length, "the world presents us with 2 types of mysteries. There are those that yield to pure logic, where facts arrange themselves into inescapable conclusions. And then there are those that, even when solved, leave us with questions that no amount of deduction can answer. This case, I fear, belongs to the latter category. What questions remain unanswered? The question of whether truth is always worth pursuing. Sir Lionel discovered the truth about Crowther's ancient betrayal, and that truth destroyed their friendship and led indirectly to the crime we have just solved. Might not some truths be better left undiscovered? Might not some mysteries serve a useful purpose by remaining mysterious? I considered this carefully. It was unlike Holmes to express such philosophical uncertainty, and I recognized it as a sign that the case had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. "I believe," I said slowly, "that truth is always preferable to comfortable deception. Sir Lionel had a right to know how Crowther had betrayed him, as just as the families ruined by the railway fraud had a right to know the true source of Sir Lionel's charitable support. The truth may be painful, but it is also liberating. It allows us to make informed choices rather than living in ignorance." Holmes smiled faintly. "Spoken like a true adherent of the scientific method, my dear fellow. And perhaps you're right. Perhaps the pain of truth is preferable to the comfort of illusion. But I suspect the answer depends upon the individual and the circumstances." He rose and moved to his desk, where the reconstructed will lay in a folder awaiting delivery to Mr. Fallow. He placed his hand upon it, a gesture almost tender in its care. This document represents Sir Lionel's final attempt to impose order upon the chaos his past had created. Through it, he sought to ensure that his atonement would continue, that the families who had suffered would receive support, that truth would be acknowledged and recorded. Crowther's attempt to prevent its execution was not merely a crime against the law, but a crime against truth itself. And that, Watson, is why we were right to pursue this case to its conclusion. Then you do not regret the outcome? I regret the necessity of it. I regret that human weakness and desperation led to these circumstances. But I do not regret revealing the truth, no matter how painful it proved to be. The clock upon the mantel chimed the hour, its measured tones marking the passage of time in a world that continued its course regardless of human dramas. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe, and I knew that for him the case was truly closed. And yet, as I sat across from him in our familiar sitting room, the fire warming us against the November chill, I found myself reflecting upon the lessons the case had taught. It had demonstrated once again that the most profound deceptions are not those accomplished through violence or dramatic subterfuge, but through patience and the exploitation of trust. Crowther had committed his crime not in a moment of passion, but through careful planning, using chemistry and time as his weapons. But the case had also revealed something about the nature of friendship and loyalty, about the corrosive effects of guilt and the dangers of moral righteousness pursued without mercy. Sir Lionel and Basil Crowther had been bound together by their shared past, and that bond had ultimately destroyed them both, one in death, the other in disgrace. "Watson," Holmes said, breaking the silence, "would you be so good as to add this case to your collection? I believe it may prove instructive to future readers, though perhaps not in the ways they might expect." "I shall record it faithfully," I promised, "though I confess I'm uncertain what title to give it. Call it The Adventure of the Illegible Testament. The title captures the essential mystery while hinting at the deeper questions the case raises about clarity and obscurity, truth and deception, the things we choose to reveal and those we prefer to hide. And so I have recorded it, this strange affair that began with a document that could not be read and ended with revelations that some might have preferred remained hidden. As I write these final words, I'm conscious that the story I have told is not one of simple triumph over villainy, but rather a meditation upon the complexity of human nature and the sometimes tragic consequences of choices made long ago. The fog outside has thickened, but here within our sitting room the lamps burn brightly, casting their warm glow upon the familiar furnishings and the figure of Sherlock Holmes, already absorbed in some new problem brought by the evening post. "The world is rarely illegible," he had said, "only insufficiently examined, and in that observation lies perhaps the truest lesson of all, that patience, observation, and the willingness to look beyond the obvious can illuminate even the most obscure mysteries. Yet I would add one qualification to my friend's maxim. The world may yield its secrets to sufficient examination, but the human heart remains the most difficult text of all to decipher, written as it is in motives and memories that no amount of chemical analysis can fully reveal.